It was supposed to be a quiet evening, just me and Sarah, enjoying the kind of peace that only a night at home could bring. But then the doorbell rang. The moment I opened the door, I saw him standing there. Mark. Her ex. And I could see the storm brewing in his eyes. I'd heard about Mark before, of course. Sarah had told me about him in passing, the wild phase of her life that she was more than happy to leave behind. He was a part of her past, and in my mind, that was where he was meant to stay. But there he was, standing on my doorstep like he had a right to be there. The tension in the air was immediate. I could feel it, thick and suffocating, as I met his gaze. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me as if he was assessing me, deciding whether I was worthy of Sarah, worthy of the life she had with me. I felt my pulse quicken, a wave of irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark's lips curled into a smirk, and he shifted on his feet, clearly aware of the effect he was having on me. I wasn't intimidated, not in the slightest. But the audacity of him showing up uninvited, after all these years, did irritate me. "I just wanted to talk to Sarah," he said smoothly, his tone casual, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. I didn't think she'd mind. It's been a while, after all. "Sarah's not here," I said, my hand still on the door, ready to shut it if I needed to. He didn't budge. In fact, he stepped forward, invading my space in that typical arrogant way. The kind of move that made it clear he thought he was in control of the situation. But I wasn't about to let him take the reins. Not in my house. Not on my watch. "I don't believe you," Mark replied, his voice taking on a more challenging tone. "I know she's here. She told me she'd be home. I think she'd like to see me." I felt a flare of anger shoot through me, but I didn't let it show. I was much more composed than Mark gave me credit for. I had one rule when it came to Sarah's past: don't let it interfere with our present. And right now, Mark was walking on the edge of that boundary. "I don't care what she told you," I said, my voice cold now. "She's not here, and I don't think it's a good idea for you to hang around waiting for her." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't back down. Instead, he chuckled, a low, almost mocking sound that rubbed me the wrong way. "I don't think you understand the situation here," he said, stepping even closer. His scent, something musky and overbearing, pushed its way into my senses. "I'm not leaving without talking to Sarah. It's important." Something about his words, the underlying threat I could feel in the air, made my spine stiffen. I wasn't one to back down, especially when it came to protecting what was mine. "I said she's not here," I repeated, my grip tightening on the door. "And if you don't leave, I'm calling the cops." I could see the moment Mark considered calling my bluff. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he evaluated whether I was serious. His smirk faded slightly, but only for a second. He wasn't an idiot, he could tell I wasn't joking. "Look, man," he said, his voice softening for just a moment, "I get it. I really do. But I'm not here to start trouble. I'm just here to clear the air with Sarah. She deserves that, don't you think?" I didn't buy it. I wasn't naive enough to think this was just some innocent visit. There was something more to it, something lurking underneath his words, and I wasn't about to let him use Sarah as a pawn in whatever game he was playing. "You're not welcome here," I said firmly, my patience running thin. "And I'm not asking you again." Mark's eyes flashed with something dark, annoyance, maybe? Or something more dangerous, but it was enough to send a shiver of unease through me. But even then, I wasn't backing down. He took a deep breath, clearly weighing his options. I saw the tension in his jaw, the way he clenched his fists as if he were debating whether to push me further. But before he could make a move, I shut the door with a forceful slam, cutting him off mid-sentence. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the doorknob, my heart racing in my chest. That had been too close. The last thing I needed was some uninvited drama from Sarah's past entering our home. I didn't know what Mark was really after, but I had no intention of finding out. I turned away from the door, exhaling slowly, trying to calm the storm that had already started brewing inside me. But even as I walked toward the living room, my mind was racing. What the hell had just happened? And more importantly, what was Mark really after? I wasn't sure if I could trust myself to stay calm if he decided to push again, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let him control the narrative. Not in my house. Not with Sarah. I needed to get ahead of this. To make sure he knew exactly where his place was, and it was nowhere near us. As I sank down onto the couch, I ran my fingers through my hair, taking a moment to collect myself. Mark's sudden appearance had thrown me off, and I had no doubt that Sarah would be just as rattled by the visit. I didn't know what kind of hold he had over her, but I wasn't about to let him re-enter her life on his terms. The doorbell rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I knew what had to be done. I stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the doorbell ringing still hanging in the air like a ticking time bomb. My heart was racing, faster than I'd like to admit. I knew I couldn't let Mark come back into our lives, but there was this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me this wouldn't be the last time he tried to waltz in uninvited. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension course through me. He'd already pushed me to the brink once tonight, and I had no intention of letting him get any closer. The problem was, I knew Sarah would be hurt by this. She wouldn't like it. She'd want to hear him out, understand why he was suddenly here, why he felt the need to break the peace we'd fought so hard to build. But no. This wasn't just a friendly visit. Mark wasn't interested in catching up. I could feel it in the air, the subtle threat behind every word he'd said. It was time to set boundaries, to make it crystal clear that our relationship wasn't some playground where he could waltz back in at his convenience. It was mine and Sarah's, ours, and I would be damned if I let anyone, especially someone from her past, tear it apart. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. I took a deep breath, then turned toward the door, determined. As my hand gripped the knob, I could feel the heat rising in my chest. I had no intention of letting Mark drag this out further. He wasn't welcome, and he needed to understand that. I swung open the door before he had a chance to knock again, the cool evening air hitting my face as Mark's frustrated eyes locked onto mine. "Look," I said, my voice firm but not unkind, "I'm done with this. You need to leave. Right now." Mark looked at me, his posture stiffening slightly as he took in my words. There was a hint of irritation on his face, but there was something else too, something that flickered briefly in his eyes. Confusion? Doubt? Maybe. But it was quickly replaced by a defiant smirk. This was a man used to getting his way, and I could tell he wasn't used to being dismissed so easily. But that's exactly what I was doing. "You think you can just shut me out?" he asked, his tone challenging, but it lacked the same confidence it had earlier. He was testing me now, pushing to see how far he could go without making things worse. "I don't think," I replied coolly. "I know." I could see the anger building behind his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, but I wasn't afraid. If anything, the fire in me only burned brighter. This was my home, my space, and I was drawing the line. There was no room for his drama here. Mark stepped forward again, this time with more purpose, but I didn't move. I stood my ground. "She'll want to hear what I have to say," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "You can't keep her from me forever." His words hit me like a slap in the face, but I kept my expression neutral. "She's not here, and she doesn't need to hear from you right now. Whatever you think you're doing here, it stops tonight. I won't let you drag her back into your mess." Mark's lips tightened, and for a brief moment I thought he might lash out. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw working as he struggled to maintain control. I wasn't sure if it was frustration or something darker lurking beneath, but the atmosphere between us thickened with unspoken tension. "You think you can protect her from me?" Mark sneered, his voice laced with disdain. You think you can just take her away from the life we shared? I stepped back, my eyes narrowing as I took in his words. There it was, the crux of the problem. Mark wasn't here because he missed Sarah or wanted closure. He was here because he believed he had some kind of right to her. And that was where I drew the line. No one is taking anyone away from anyone, I said sharply, my voice firm. But you need to understand something, Mark. Sarah has a life now. With me. And if you really cared about her, you'd respect that. You'd respect us. His eyes flashed for a moment, the mask of control cracking. She's not yours to keep, he spat, his tone venomous. You think you're the one who's going to give her everything? You think you're the one who's going to make her happy? There was a sickening sense of possessiveness in his words, something that made my skin crawl. But I didn't flinch. I wasn't about to let him undermine everything Sarah and I had worked for, everything we were building together. I don't need to make her happy, I replied, my voice steady. She's already happy. And it's not up to you to decide who she deserves or who she's with. You had your chance. It's over now. So, I'm asking you, no, I'm telling you, leave. I could see the frustration and disbelief written across his face as he processed my words. He didn't like hearing it. But that was exactly why I needed to say it. I needed to take control of the situation, to remind him that I was no pushover. He wasn't going to walk all over me, or Sarah, just because he decided it was his turn to stir up chaos. He stared at me for a long moment, his chest rising and falling as if he were deciding whether or not to push back further. His eyes flicked toward the street behind him, a brief moment of indecision passing over his face. And then, with one last look of contempt, he turned and walked away without saying another word. The door slammed shut behind him, and I let out a long breath, finally allowing myself to relax. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding on until the tension in my shoulders finally began to ease. I'd done it. I had stood up for what mattered. For Sarah. For us. But as I stood there in the silence of the house, I realized that this wouldn't be the last time Mark tried to intrude. His visit tonight had been a clear message, he wasn't going to give up so easily. And if I wasn't careful, his attempts to stir drama could threaten everything I had with Sarah. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning. I had to make sure I was ready for whatever came next. It was late when I finally sank into the couch, my mind buzzing with everything that had just happened. I had shut the door in Mark's face, twice now, and had firmly told him to stay out of our lives. But that wasn't the end of it. I knew that. No, what loomed now was the aftermath, the fallout from my confrontation with him. I couldn't help but replay the whole thing in my head. The way he had stepped toward me like he was still trying to assert some kind of dominance. The cocky smirk he wore, thinking he could waltz in and stir up trouble because he felt entitled to something that wasn't his anymore. The anger had been almost palpable, thick in the air between us. But the worst part? I had felt a flicker of doubt the moment I closed the door on him. Sarah was still in the kitchen, and I could hear her moving around, the soft clink of dishes as she put away the dinner we'd shared earlier. She had no idea what had happened at the door, and part of me wasn't sure how to tell her. Would she be upset? Would she understand? Or worse, would she defend him? My heart twisted just thinking about it. I hadn't expected Mark to show up at our door, especially not after all this time. And now that he had, it felt like I had opened a door I couldn't easily close. I had to prepare for what came next, whether it was dealing with Sarah's feelings or facing Mark's inevitable next move. Because I knew, deep down, he wouldn't just leave it at that. I was still caught up in my thoughts when Sarah walked into the living room, her eyes immediately searching my face for any sign of tension. She didn't say anything at first, but I could tell she was trying to gauge my mood. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft. She was studying me carefully, like she knew something had happened but wasn't sure what it was. I hesitated, my fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Mark came by tonight, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice even. He wanted to talk to you. Her face froze for a split second, and I saw the color drain from her cheeks. I wasn't sure if it was shock or something else, but I didn't miss the way her eyes flicked toward the door, as though expecting him to be standing there still. Mark, she whispered. He came here? Her voice was tight, and I could tell it was taking everything she had not to let the panic creep into her tone. It wasn't anger, no, it was fear. I could feel it, and it hit me like a wave. Yeah, I nodded, trying to keep things as calm as possible. He showed up unannounced. I told him you weren't here, but he didn't leave easily. He tried to push his way in, tried to make excuses about needing to talk to you. Her eyes flickered with emotion, but she didn't say anything right away. She just stood there, taking it in, clearly processing the situation. I knew this wasn't easy for her, hell, it wasn't easy for me either. Mark was a part of her past, someone she had cared for deeply at one point, but that didn't mean I wanted him coming back into our lives like this. Not when we had built something so solid, so real. Sarah, I started, my voice low, you know I don't want drama in our lives. I don't want him showing up here, trying to disrupt everything we've built. I had to make it clear to him that he's not welcome. But you need to understand, I'm doing this for us. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the floor, and I could see the conflict warring in her eyes. She wasn't angry with me, not exactly, but there was something else there. Something I couldn't quite read. I don't know what he wants, I continued, trying to fill the silence. But whatever it is, it's not good. He's trying to get under my skin, trying to make me feel like I'm not enough for you. But I won't let him manipulate you. You deserve more than that. I watched her closely, my chest tightening with anticipation. Would she understand? Would she see the bigger picture here? Finally, she looked up at me, her expression softening. I know you're just trying to protect me, she said quietly. And I appreciate that. I really do. But I don't know how to explain it. Mark and we shared something once. And even though that's over, it's hard to just erase everything we had. I didn't want him showing up either. But you still care about him? I asked, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It's not that. It's just, sometimes it's hard, you know? There's history there. And I don't want you to feel threatened by him, because I don't want anything to come between us. But it's hard for me to just forget everything, even if I know it's over. I could feel the knot in my stomach loosen just slightly. She wasn't still in love with him. I could tell that much. But there was still a part of her that hadn't fully let go of their past. And I understood that. I did. But it didn't make this situation any easier. I get it, I said after a long pause. I get that you have a history with him. But this is different now. We're different. And I won't stand by and let him try to come between us. He's not welcome here, Sarah. And I need you to see that, too. She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine. I do see that. I don't want you to feel like I'm not with you. That's the last thing I want. I took her hand, squeezing it gently. I know you're with me. And I know you're not going to let him come between us. But we need to make sure he understands that, too. There was a moment of quiet between us, a pause where the weight of the situation settled over us both. But in that silence, I could feel the shift. We were in this together, and we were stronger for it. Sarah understood what I was trying to say. She understood that Mark needed to be shut out completely, that any presence of him, even a lingering thought of him, had no place in our lives anymore. I'll talk to him if I have to, she said after a while, her voice steady now. But only if it's the only way to make sure he stays out of our lives for good. I nodded, relieved that she saw things the way I did. We'll figure it out together. We'll make sure he knows where he stands. He's not going to disrupt this. I wasn't sure how far Mark was willing to push, or if he'd make another move after tonight. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let him destroy what I had with Sarah. We were stronger than that. And if he tried again? He wouldn't know what hit him. It wasn't long before the atmosphere in our house settled back into its familiar rhythm. Sarah and I worked through the uneasy tension of the night, and while things weren't back to perfect, we knew that we had a solid foundation. We had each other's backs. But just beneath the surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wouldn't stay away for long. And I was right. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. My stomach dropped the second I saw the message preview on the screen. It was from Mark. "Hey, I think we need to talk. Sarah deserves to know the truth." I clenched my jaw, the familiar sense of frustration rising within me. This wasn't over. He was back, and he was playing games. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room, to just block him and move on. But I knew that wasn't the smart move. Mark wasn't someone you could simply ignore. If I ignored him, he would keep trying to chip away at the walls I'd built around Sarah and me. So instead, I took a deep breath and typed out a reply, keeping my response as calm and controlled as possible. "You're not welcome here, Mark. Stay away from Sarah. Whatever truth you think you need to tell her doesn't concern me, and it doesn't concern her. Leave us alone." I hit send, and for a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. That he would get the message and we could go back to our lives. But I knew better. Mark wasn't the type to back down that easily. Sure enough, minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was longer, angrier. "You don't get to control everything, man. Sarah deserves to know what really happened between us. She's not some pawn in your little game. I'll be in touch." I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling slightly. I wasn't afraid of him. I knew that, deep down. But his audacity was getting under my skin in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had tried to be patient. I had tried to play it cool. But now, I was done being nice. I replied with one last, decisive message: "If you show up here again, I'll make sure you regret it. This is your last warning." I didn't want to escalate things, but I couldn't let him believe that he had the upper hand. The ball was in my court now. If Mark wanted to keep this up, I was ready to take whatever measures were necessary to protect what was mine. To protect Sarah. I didn't hear from him for the rest of the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only fueled the fire. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I just didn't know yet how far Mark was willing to push. That night, Sarah and I sat down to dinner. We tried to talk like everything was normal, but there was an underlying tension that neither of us could ignore. I could see that she was struggling with the fact that Mark hadn't completely left her past behind, that he was still trying to insert himself into her life. I knew she didn't want to be the cause of any conflict between us, but at the same time, there was that piece of her, one that had shared so much with him, that was struggling to let go. I couldn't blame her. But I also couldn't let it go on. Not while Mark was actively trying to ruin what we had. "Hey," I said softly as we finished our meal, trying to break the silence. "You okay?" Sarah put down her fork and met my eyes. There was a sadness there, a deep exhaustion, as though the last few days had taken a toll on her. "I'm fine," she replied, but her voice wavered slightly. I don't know, I feel like I'm being torn in two. Part of me wants to move on from all of it. But then, there's this other part of me that just wants to know what he has to say." I exhaled slowly, trying to find the right words. "I get it. I really do. But Mark is the past. You don't owe him anything. You don't need to go digging up things that will only bring pain. Whatever he's trying to say, it's not going to help us." She bit her lip, clearly conflicted. I know. It's just, he's not making it easy. And I keep thinking maybe if I hear him out, I can finally close that chapter for good. You know? I reached across the table and took her hand. I'm not asking you to forget about your past. But I am asking you to focus on us now. On the future. We can't keep looking back every time something like this happens. Sarah sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window, as if trying to find some clarity in the dimming light outside. I know. I just don't want to make things worse for you, or for me. I never meant for this to spill over into our lives like this. I squeezed her hand tighter. It's not about that, Sarah. This isn't about me being upset because of something you did. It's about him. He doesn't get to waltz in here and try to turn our world upside down. That's what I'm upset about. She looked back at me, her expression softening. I don't want him in our lives either. I promise. I'll deal with it, okay? I just need to figure out how. I nodded. And I'll be here. Whatever it takes, I'm with you. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering just how much farther Mark was willing to take things. I knew he wouldn't stop. If anything, this was just the beginning. The question was, how far would he push before he realized that we weren't going to let him win? The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected. It started with a phone call. The next morning, I was at work, seated in my office when my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, my heart immediately skipping a beat. It was an unfamiliar number. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something deep inside told me this time I shouldn't. I swiped to answer it, holding my breath for what was to come. Hello? I said, trying to sound casual, though the tension in my voice betrayed me. Is this your name? The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm, but there was an underlying sense of control to it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Yes, I replied cautiously. Who is this? It's Mark, came the cool response. I think we need to talk. I froze. The nerve of this guy. After everything, after the way I'd made myself clear, he was still trying to worm his way into our lives? My blood boiled as I gripped the edge of the desk, trying to keep my voice steady. We've already talked, I said firmly. And I told you, you're not welcome here. Whatever you think you need to say, it doesn't matter. You don't have a place in my life, and you sure as hell don't have a place in Sarah's. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a second, I wondered if he'd just hang up, but then I heard a chuckle. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was cold, almost mocking. My pulse quickened. You really think it's that simple? Mark's voice cut through, and I could feel the challenge in his words. You think I'm just going to walk away because you say so? I narrowed my eyes, standing up from my desk. You can try all you want, but I've already made myself clear. I won't tolerate you pushing your way back into Sarah's life. He let out a slow breath, almost as if he was savoring the moment. You don't get it, do you? I'm not trying to push my way back into her life. I'm trying to make sure she knows the truth. The whole truth. About what happened between us. The things she deserves to know. A wave of unease washed over me. My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself to remain calm. This wasn't the time to let him see that he'd gotten under my skin. You've had your chance, Mark, I said, my voice low and controlled. You're not going to get another one. Whatever truth you think you have, you can keep it to yourself. It doesn't matter. What matters is that Sarah and I are together now, and we're fine without your interference. He was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted. It was colder now, more menacing. You don't know who you're dealing with. You've never seen me when I'm backed into a corner. I'll make sure Sarah gets the full picture. You can't stop me. My breath caught in my throat, and something cold settled in my chest. His words weren't just threats, they were promises. He wasn't backing down. This was more than a simple attempt to stir things up, this was about power. About control. And Mark was clearly willing to escalate things to get what he wanted. I knew right then that I couldn't wait around for him to make his next move. I needed to take control before it was too late. I don't care what you think you can do, Mark, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the knot of anxiety growing in my stomach. You're not going to break us. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you away from Sarah. And you can take that as a warning. Leave her alone. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then, almost too casually, Mark spoke again. We'll see about that. And with that, the line went dead. I stared at my phone for a moment, feeling the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just idle posturing anymore. He was serious. This was no longer just a battle for Sarah's attention or her past, it had turned into a war. And Mark was playing dirty. I couldn't waste any more time. I needed to act. When I got home that night, Sarah was already there, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I walked through the door, her expression soft but wary. I could tell that she had sensed something was off. The air between us had been tense ever since Mark showed up, and I knew she could feel the storm building in the background. Hey, she said gently, offering me a small smile. How was your day? I dropped my bag by the door and ran a hand through my hair. I couldn't hide the frustration in my voice. Mark called. Her face immediately shifted, the smile fading as she set her glass down. What did he want? I sat down beside her, the words tumbling out before I had a chance to filter them. He's not backing off. He wants to talk to you. He says he has things to tell you, the truth about what happened between them. And he's not going to let it go. Her eyes widened with a mix of concern and disbelief. What kind of truth? I don't know, I said, feeling my chest tighten. But it's not good. He's trying to manipulate you, to make you question everything we've built together. He's trying to tear us apart. She sighed, running her fingers through her hair. I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm not saying I want him back, I don't. But he was a huge part of my life, and the idea that he could just come and start telling me things I didn't know, it's messing with my head. I could see how torn she was, how much this situation was eating away at her. But there was no time for uncertainty now. Mark wasn't going to stop. And if we didn't do something soon, this would spiral out of control. I can't keep waiting for him to make the next move, I said, trying to keep the urgency out of my voice. I'm going to handle this. I'll deal with him once and for all. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with both concern and gratitude. I don't want you to get hurt because of this. But if you think it's the only way to put an end to it, then I trust you. I nodded, though inside, I was already plotting my next steps. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation or a few threats exchanged. Mark had made it clear that he wasn't playing by the rules. If he wanted a fight, I'd give him one he wouldn't forget. It was time to put an end to this. For good. The following morning, I didn't waste any time. I had spent the night thinking about what I needed to do, and now, it was time to take action. I wasn't going to wait for Mark to escalate things any further, and I wasn't going to allow him to continue threatening everything I had built with Sarah. I had to make sure he understood, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was out of the picture for good. I had a plan. It wasn't a perfect one, but it was the only one I could trust at this point. I got dressed in something neutral, keeping my appearance low-key, and grabbed my keys. As I walked past Sarah, she looked up from the couch, her eyes filled with worry. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked quietly, her voice filled with a mix of anxiety and concern. She had every right to feel that way. This wasn't just about me and Mark anymore. It was about us, about our future together. And I couldn't let him tear that apart. I have to, I replied firmly. I won't let him interfere with our lives. This ends today. With that, I left the house, the weight of the situation settling heavily on my shoulders. It felt like the calm before the storm, but I was ready. I knew that the confrontation would be messy, maybe even dangerous, but I couldn't back down. Not now. I drove across town to the address Mark had given me the last time we spoke, his apartment. It wasn't a place I'd ever been to before, and I had no idea what to expect when I arrived. But one thing was certain, this had to be handled in person. It was the only way to make sure Mark knew once and for all that he wasn't welcome in our lives. When I reached his building, I parked on the street and made my way toward the entrance. The air felt thick with tension, and my heart raced as I approached his door. For all my preparation, for all the resolve I had built up over the past few days, there was a small part of me that still wasn't sure what was going to happen once I walked through that door. But I couldn't afford to hesitate. I rang the doorbell, and the seconds felt like hours as I waited. When the door finally creaked open, I was greeted with the sight of Mark standing there, his expression unreadable. He was dressed casually, but there was something almost predatory about the way he stood, his posture tense, as if he were prepared for a confrontation. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the surge of anger bubbling inside me. Mark didn't immediately respond. He just looked at me for a long moment, his lips curling into a half-smirk. "I think we both know why I'm here," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. "You're not the only one who's tired of playing nice. I wasn't here to exchange pleasantries. I wasn't here to argue or negotiate." I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the silence. "You need to leave Sarah alone. You've crossed the line too many times already. This is your final warning. Stay out of our lives, or I'll make sure you regret it." His eyes flickered with something dark, but he didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. "You think you can intimidate me? You think this is about you?" "It's about us," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "This is about Sarah. She's my life now. Not yours. And I won't let you ruin what we have." Mark's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. He stepped back, his gaze never leaving mine. "You think you can just throw me out of the picture? You think you can erase everything we had? You don't even know what I'm capable of." I took a deep breath, letting the weight of his words settle. But I wasn't backing down. "I know exactly what you're capable of. And I know that none of it matters anymore. Whatever truth you think you're holding over Sarah's head, it's not going to work. You've lost." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between us. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark was still staring at me, his expression unreadable, and I could feel the weight of his next move hanging in the balance. Then, he spoke again, this time with an edge to his voice. "You really think you've won? You think you've got her now? Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. You have no idea what I'm capable of when I'm pushed." I wasn't about to let him get the last word. "You've already pushed. And you've already lost." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but I wasn't waiting for him to make his move. I had already made up my mind. Mark wasn't going to get another chance to mess with our lives. I turned and walked away, heading toward the door, leaving him standing there in the silence. But before I could reach the stairs, I heard his voice again, this time tinged with something darker. "You'll regret this." I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had already made my decision, and no matter what threats he made, no matter how far he pushed, I wasn't going to let him control my life, or Sarah's, any longer. I left the building, the finality of the situation hitting me with every step. It was over. No more games. No more threats. Mark had finally pushed too far, and now there was no turning back. When I returned home, Sarah was waiting for me, her eyes searching my face for signs of what had happened. She was anxious, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sweater. I could see the worry etched in her features, and I could feel her heart beating faster than usual. "Did you do it?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I nodded, walking over to her and taking her hands in mine. "It's done. He won't bother us again." Her eyes searched mine, relief flooding through her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," I said firmly, my grip tightening around her hands. "It's over. He won't get in the way anymore." She wrapped her arms around me, and for the first time in days, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. The past was finally behind us. We had won.